The first thing I saw was the number $47,000,000, printed in sharp black ink across a check with my name on it, sliding across a polished marble table while 300 people went completely silent, and for the first time in my life, no one was laughing at me. But that wasn't how the night started, not even close. My name is Lila Bennett, I'm 29 years old, and 3 weeks ago, I was sitting at the far edge of a ballroom at the Grand Regent Hotel in downtown Chicago, wearing a $79 dress I bought on clearance, watching my sister become everything my parents ever believed I could never be. Audrey Bennett stood at the center of the room under a chandelier that probably cost more than my entire apartment, smiling, shaking hands, accepting congratulations like she had rehearsed this moment her entire life, which she had, because in our family there were always two roles, the one who shines, and the one who stands just out of frame, and I was the one who stood out of frame. I always had been. "Make sure you stay near the back," my mother whispered to me before the event started, adjusting Audrey's hair instead of looking at me. "We don't want any confusion tonight." Confusion, that was her word for me. My father had a different one. He preferred something simpler, something sharper, the dumb one. He'd say it casually, like a fact everyone already agreed on, like saying the sky is blue or winter is cold. "Audrey got the brains." He joked to business partners over dinner, a glass of $200 Cabernet in his hand. And Lila, well, she got the personality. People would laugh, polite at first, then more comfortable once they saw my parents weren't kidding. I used to laugh too softly, like if I laughed first it wouldn't hurt as much, but it always did. It's strange how a label can become a place you live in, not just something people say about you, but something that follows you into every room, every conversation, every silence. By the time I was 16, teachers spoke slower to me. By college, advisors suggested simpler paths. And by 25, even I had stopped correcting anyone. I just let them think what they wanted, because correcting them never changed anything. It just made things awkward, and awkward was worse than invisible in my family. Invisible at least meant quiet, predictable, manageable. And that's exactly what I was that night, sitting at table 17 near the service doors, watching waiters carry trays of champagne past me like I wasn't part of the event, which technically I wasn't. This night was for Audrey, for her promotion, her recognition, her future. My father stood near the stage, introducing her to investors, using phrases like inherited instinct and natural strategist, words I had never once heard directed at me, not even close. I remember folding my hands in my lap, tracing the edge of my thumb with my fingernail just to stay grounded, telling myself the same thing I had told myself for years: it doesn't matter, just get through the night, smile when needed, stay quiet, leave early. But what I didn't know then, what no one in that room knew, was that this carefully choreographed night, this perfect celebration of the right daughter, had already been rewritten before it even began. And the person who rewrote it wasn't my father or my mother or Audrey. It was the one person they all underestimated even more than they underestimated me. And in less than 10 minutes, everything they thought they knew about me and about themselves was going to change. I remember thinking how quiet the room felt from where I was sitting, not because it was actually quiet. There was music, glasses clinking, people talking in low, confident voices, but because none of it was meant for me. It was like watching a movie with the sound turned down, everything happening just out of reach. I could see my father near the stage, one hand resting on Audrey's shoulder as if he was physically anchoring her to the future he had already decided was hers. "She has the instinct for it," he said to a man in a navy suit, someone important. You could tell by the way people leaned slightly toward him when he spoke. "Always has." My mother stood just a few feet away, smiling the kind of smile she saved for public moments, the kind that looked warm but never quite reached her eyes. She adjusted Audrey's bracelet, smoothed a strand of her hair, small precise movements that said more than words ever could. "This is the daughter that matters." And I stayed exactly where I was told to stay, table 17, half in shadow, close enough to be counted as family, far enough to not disrupt the image. A waiter paused beside me with a tray of champagne and gave me a polite nod. The kind you give to someone you are not sure belongs but do not want to offend. I shook my head, not because I did not want the drink, but because I did not want to risk standing out even for a second. That was the rule I had learned early: do not create friction, do not create questions, just exist quietly and the night will pass. Faster, I glanced down at my phone, more out of habit than purpose. There were no new messages. There never were on nights like this, because no one was waiting for me. No one was wondering how I felt sitting in a room celebrating a version of success that had never once included me. And the strange part is, it did not even feel unfair anymore. It just felt familiar, like slipping into a role you had been rehearsing your entire life. I watched as Audrey laughed at something my father said. tilting her head just slightly, perfectly composed, perfectly confident. She had always been good at that, knowing when to speak, when to pause, when to let someone else fill the silence. I used to think that was intelligence. Maybe it is. Or maybe it is just a different kind of training, the kind I never received, because when you are labeled early, when you are categorized as the one who does not quite get it, people stop investing in your growth. They stop explaining, stop including, stop expecting anything beyond quiet compliance, and over time you stop expecting it too. You adjust, you observe, you learn in ways no one notices, and that is exactly what I had been doing for years. Even now, sitting at the edge of this room, I was not as disconnected as I looked. I was listening, watching patterns, noticing who spoke to whom, who deferred, who controlled the conversation without raising their voice. It was a habit I never talked about because there was no point. No one had ever asked what I was good at. They had already decided what I was not. A burst of applause pulled my attention back to the front of the room as my father stepped onto the stage. The lights shifted slightly brighter now, focused, intentional. He adjusted the microphone, glanced at the audience, then at Audrey, and for a brief second, I felt something I had not felt in a long time, a flicker of something that looked almost like anticipation, not hope. I had learned better than that, but something close enough to notice. He began speaking about legacy, about the Bennett name, about continuity and trust, words that sounded impressive but always carried the same underlying message. There is a place for each of us, and mine was never at the center. I could feel the weight of that truth settling in again, familiar, steady, predictable, and I told myself the same thing I always did, just a little longer, just get through this part, because what I did not realize yet was that the moment everyone else believed was the peak of the night was actually the last moment things would make sense, and after that, nothing about this room, this family, or the story they had been telling about me would hold together the same way again. My father's voice carried easily across the ballroom, smooth and controlled, the kind of voice that made people stop talking without even realizing it. Tonight is not just about achievement, he said, pausing just long enough for the room to settle into silence. It is about legacy. And I felt that word land somewhere deep in my chest, because in our family, legacy was never just a word. It was a line you either stood inside or outside of, and I had always known exactly where I stood. He began listing Audrey's accomplishments, the internships, the awards, the partnerships she had already helped secure. Each one delivered like evidence in a case that had long since been decided. People nodded. Some whispered to each other, impressed, approving. I watched the way Audrey held herself, shoulders relaxed, chin slightly lifted, receiving it all as if it was simply the natural order of things. And maybe for her it was. My mother stepped closer to the stage, her expression soft, proud, the kind of pride I had only ever seen from a distance. And then my father said something that made the room shift just slightly, not enough for most people to notice, but enough for me. From the very beginning it was clear which of my daughters understood how this world works, he said, his tone light, almost joking, but I knew better. I always knew better. A few people laughed quietly, expecting the rest of the sentence, expecting the comparison that always came next, and he did not disappoint. Audrey has always had the mind for it, he continued, gesturing toward her. She sees the big picture, she connects the dots. Another pause, and then, almost as an afterthought, he added, and Lila, well, she has her own strengths. The laughter came louder this time, more comfortable, because now they knew exactly where to place me. I felt my hands tighten slightly in my lap, but my face stayed still. It always did. I had practiced that too, the ability to absorb a moment without reacting to it, to let it pass over me like it belonged to someone else. I glanced around the room, watching the reactions, the small smiles, the quick glances in my direction, some sympathetic, most indifferent, a few openly amused, and I realized something in that moment that I had never fully admitted to myself before. It was not just that my family believed I was less, it was that they had taught everyone else to believe it too. They had built a version of me that existed in other people's minds, a version I could not argue with because it had been reinforced too many times, in too many rooms, over too many years. And standing there on that stage, my father was not just praising Audrey, he was reinforcing the structure that kept me exactly where I was supposed to be, just outside of relevance, just outside of expectation. I should have felt embarrassed or angry, or something sharp enough to push back against what was happening. But instead I felt something else, something quieter, a kind of clarity that settled in slowly, like a realization that had been forming for years and was finally ready to surface. Because the truth was, none of this surprised me, not the words, not the laughter, not even the way my mother avoided looking at me as she clapped along with everyone else. What surprised me was how little it mattered in that moment, because somewhere beneath the noise of the room, beneath the weight of everything my father was saying, there was another thought, steady and unmoving, something my grandmother had told me months before she passed, something that had never quite made sense until now. "Let them finish," she had said, her voice calm, certain. "Do not interrupt them, do not correct them, just let them show you exactly who they are." I had not understood it then, but sitting there, listening to my father define me one more time in front of an audience that was all too ready to accept it, I finally did. This was not the moment I needed to fight. This was the moment I needed to watch. Because what they did not know, what no one in that room could possibly know yet, was that this speech, this carefully constructed narrative about who I was and who I was not, was about to collide with something they had no control over, something already set in motion long before this night began. And for the first time, I did not feel small sitting there at the edge of the room. I felt like I was waiting for something to arrive. The applause swelled as my father stepped back from the microphone, satisfied, like he had just delivered something important, something final, and for a moment the room moved exactly the way it was supposed to. People stood, glasses lifted, conversations restarted, and Audrey was immediately surrounded, hands reaching out to congratulate her, voices overlapping. Well deserved. Incredible future ahead. Your father must be so proud. And I watched her smile widen just slightly, not too much, just enough to show gratitude without losing control. She was always good at that balance, always knew how to exist inside a moment without being consumed by it. I stayed seated, letting the movement of the room flow around me, unnoticed, unbothered. A waiter finally set a glass of champagne down in front of me without asking, maybe out of habit, maybe out of pity. I was not sure which one bothered me more. I picked it up but did not drink, just held it lightly between my fingers, feeling the cool condensation against my skin, grounding, steady. Real, unlike everything else in that room. I could hear my mother's voice somewhere to the left, soft but animated. She has always been like this, she said, meaning Audrey. Even as a child you could tell. And then a quieter tone, one I recognized instantly, the one reserved for explanations that needed to be softened. Lila is different, she added, and I did not need to hear the rest to know how that sentence ended. I had heard every version of it already. Different meant slower, meant less, meant not quite enough. I let the words pass through me the same way I always had, without reacting, without turning, without giving anyone the satisfaction of seeing it land, because reacting would have required energy. And I had stopped spending energy on moments like this a long time ago. Instead, I focused on something else, something small, the way my father moved through the room now, shaking hands, accepting praise as if it belonged to him as much as it did to Audrey. The way people leaned in when he spoke, how they laughed half a second earlier than necessary, signaling agreement before he had even finished his sentence. It was a pattern, one I had seen before. Power was rarely loud, it was subtle, structured, reinforced through repetition, and tonight was no different except for one detail that did not fit, not yet, but I could feel it there like a shift in the air before a storm you cannot see. I glanced toward the entrance of the ballroom, the tall double doors framed in gold, 2 staff members standing quietly at either side. And for a second I thought about leaving, just slipping out while no one was paying attention. It would have been easy, no one would have stopped me, no one would have asked where I was going. I could have been halfway home before anyone noticed I was gone, if they noticed at all. And that thought felt familiar too, the instinct to remove myself before something uncomfortable could deepen, before another comment, another look, another reminder of where I stood. But then I remembered my grandmother again, not her voice this time, but the way she used to look at me, steady, unwavering, like she was seeing something no one else even thought to look for. You do not leave before the truth arrives, she had told me once, months before everything changed. I had not understood what she meant then. I thought she was talking about patience, about resilience, about enduring things until they improved. But sitting there now, watching the room orbit around a version of success that had never included me, I realized she had meant something else entirely. She had meant timing, because truth, real truth, does not announce itself early. It waits, it lets everyone settle into their assumptions, into their confidence, into their certainty, and then it arrives when it has the most impact, when there is no space left to ignore it. I shifted slightly in my chair, setting the untouched glass back down on the table, my eyes still on those doors, because something inside me, something quiet but certain, was telling me that the night was not over, not even close, and whatever was coming next was not going to ask for permission to enter. It was simply going to walk in and change everything. There was a moment, right after I decided not to leave, when everything slowed down just enough for me to notice the smallest details, the kind most people ignore, the way one of the staff members near the entrance adjusted his posture, standing a little straighter than before, the way the other glanced toward the hallway beyond the doors as if waiting for a signal. It was subtle, almost invisible, But I had spent years noticing things like that, patterns, shifts, the quiet language of people who knew something was about to happen before anyone else did. And that was when I realized I was not the only one watching those doors. Across the room near the bar, a man I did not recognize had turned slightly, his attention fixed in the same direction. He was older, maybe in his late 60s, wearing a dark gray suit that did not try to stand out but did anyway because of how precisely it fit. He was not talking, not drinking, just waiting, and something about that stillness made him more noticeable than anyone else in the room. I felt a flicker of recognition, not of him, but of the role he seemed to occupy, the kind of person who does not arrive early because he needs to, but because timing matters to him in a way most people do not understand. I looked away before anyone could notice I was staring, letting my gaze drift back toward my family. My father was now mid-conversation with two investors, his voice lower, more controlled, the performance shifting from public pride to private negotiation. My mother stood beside Audrey, introducing her to someone new, repeating the same phrases with slight variations: top of her class, exceptional instincts, natural leader. And Audrey nodded, smiled, responded exactly the way she was supposed to. I wondered briefly if she ever felt the weight of it, the expectation, the constant need to meet the version of herself that everyone else had already decided on, or if it felt as natural to her as breathing. I had never asked and she had never offered, because in our family we did not discuss things that might disrupt the structure. We just lived inside it. I reached for the edge of the table, running my fingers lightly along the smooth surface, grounding myself again. And that was when I noticed something else, my phone vibrating softly against my leg, a text message, the screen lighting up just enough for me to see the name Harold Pierce. For a second I thought I was mistaken, that I had read it wrong, because there was no reason for him to be contacting me directly, not here, not now. But the name did not change, it stayed there, steady, real. I hesitated before opening it, a strange instinct telling me that whatever was inside that message was going to mark a line between before and after, and once I crossed it, there would be no going back to the version of the night I had been sitting in just moments ago. I unlocked my phone, my thumb hovering for a second before I finally tapped the message open. I am here. It read, simple, direct, no explanation, no context, just those 3 words. I felt something shift inside me, not panic, not fear, something steadier than that, something closer to certainty, because I knew that name, not well, not personally, but enough to understand what it meant for him to be here. Harold Pierce was not someone who attended events like this without a reason. He was the kind of man people called when something needed to be formal, official, undeniable. I looked up again, this time more deliberately, scanning the room until my eyes found him near the entrance, the man in the gray suit, still standing exactly where he had been, still watching. And in that moment everything my grandmother had said began to align in a way it never had before. The timing, the silence, the instruction to wait. This was not random, it had never been random. This night had been chosen, this moment had been set, and the only thing left was for it to unfold. I placed my phone face down on the table, my hands suddenly very still, because I understood something now that I had not allowed myself to fully believe until this exact second. Whatever was about to happen was not something I needed to chase. It was already here, already moving toward me, and for the first time in my life, I was not the one being left out of the story. I was the reason it was about to change. I did not stand up right away, even after I saw him start moving, because something in me understood that rushing this moment would break it. And I had spent too many years watching things fall apart before they had a chance to become real. So I stayed exactly where I was, my hands resting lightly on the table, my posture unchanged, my expression neutral, even as my attention sharpened in a way it never had before. Harold Pierce did not move quickly, he did not need to. The room adjusted around him without realizing it. Conversations paused just slightly as he passed, people shifting half a step to make space without knowing why. That was the kind of presence he carried, quiet authority, the kind that did not ask to be acknowledged but was anyway. I watched as he approached the edge of the main group, where my father was still speaking with the investors, and for a brief second, my father did not notice him, which almost felt impossible because my father noticed everything that mattered to him, and that was when I realized something important in his world. Harold Pierce did not exist yet, not in this context, not in this moment, but that was about to change. Harold stopped just outside the circle, waiting, not interrupting, not announcing himself, simply present, and then one of the investors turned, saw him, and the shift was immediate, subtle but unmistakable, the kind of shift that happens when someone recognizes a name before hearing it spoken. "Excuse me," the investor said softly, touching my father's arm. My father turned, irritation flickering across his face for half a second before it disappeared, replaced by polite curiosity, and then recognition settled in, not warmth, not familiarity, but awareness. "Mr. Pierce." my father said, his tone adjusting instantly, controlled, measured. I was not aware you would be attending. Harold inclined his head slightly, not quite a smile, not quite neutral, something in between. I was not originally planning to, he replied, his voice calm, steady, carrying just enough to draw attention without raising it, and I saw it happen, the room beginning to notice, small pockets of silence forming, people turning just enough to see what was happening without appearing obvious. My mother's voice faded mid-sentence, Audrey's smile paused, held in place like something waiting for direction, and I felt my pulse steady instead of race, which surprised me because this should have been overwhelming, but it was not. It felt precise, like a moment that had been measured long before I stepped into this room. Is everything all right? My father asked, a hint of caution threading through his words now, because this was no longer part of the script he controlled. Harold's gaze shifted, not to my father, not to the investors, but across the room directly toward me, and for the first time that night, I did not look away. I held his gaze steady, grounded, because something in me understood that this was the moment my grandmother had been preparing me for. Not the speech, not the humiliation, but this, the point where everything converged. Actually, Harold said, his voice still even, there is a matter that requires immediate attention. The words were simple, but the effect was not. The room stilled in a way that could not be mistaken for coincidence now. This was no longer a celebration. It was something else entirely, something formal, something that carried weight. My father straightened slightly, his shoulders tightening just enough to signal control or the attempt of it. If this is not urgent, perhaps we can discuss it privately, he said, already trying to redirect, to contain, to move this back into a space he understood. Harold shook his head once, a small movement but final. It is both urgent and public, he replied, and that was the moment everything shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely, because those two words, urgent and public, did not belong in a night like this, not unless they were about to rewrite it, and as I sat there, still at table 17, no longer invisible, no longer outside the frame, I realized that whatever came next was not just going to interrupt the story my family had been telling about me. It was going to replace it entirely. No one spoke for a full 2 seconds after he said that. And in a room like this, where silence was usually filled before it even had a chance to exist, that kind of pause felt louder than any applause. I watched my father's expression hold steady, practiced, controlled, but I knew him well enough to see the shift. Underneath the calculation, the quick search for context he did not have. I think there may be a misunderstanding, he said carefully, his voice still smooth but tighter now. If there is any business matter, we can arrange a meeting next week. He was trying to move it, to delay it, to bring it back into a structure where he could manage it, but Harold did not move, did not soften, did not follow. This cannot wait, he replied, and there was something about the way he said it that removed any room for negotiation, not aggressive, not forceful, just final, and I saw it ripple through the room, people leaning in slightly, attention sharpening, conversations fully stopping now, because whatever this was, it was no longer background noise, it was the center of the room. My mother stepped closer to my father, her hand lightly touching his arm, a gesture meant to steady, to signal unity, but her eyes flicked once toward me before quickly looking away, and that was the moment she understood, not everything, not yet, but enough to feel that something was no longer aligned with what she expected. Audrey's smile had faded into something more neutral now, composed but uncertain, her posture still perfect, but her eyes moving between my father and Harold as if trying to anticipate what came next. And I stayed exactly where I was, not moving, not speaking, but no longer invisible, because now, even if no one had turned fully toward me yet, I could feel the awareness beginning to shift, like a spotlight slowly widening. Harold reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket, the movement deliberate, unhurried, and for a brief second, the room seemed to hold its breath, not out of fear, but out of recognition that something formal was about to enter a space that had been designed for celebration. He withdrew a slim, dark leather folder, the kind that did not need to be large to carry weight, and held it lightly in one hand. This concerns the estate of Margaret Bennet, he said, and my grandmother's name, spoken in that room in that tone, changed everything instantly, because she was not just a memory, not just a loss, she was a force that had shaped the foundation my father now stood on. And hearing her name attached to something immediate, something unresolved, disrupted the certainty he had built his entire evening around. My mother's estate has already been settled, my father replied quickly, too quickly, the first crack in his composure appearing in the speed of his response. All necessary documents were reviewed months ago. Harold nodded once, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to it. Most of them were, he said, and that single word, most, landed with more weight than anything else that had been said so far. Because it implied something incomplete, something withheld, something my father did not control. I saw his jaw tighten slightly, a small movement, but enough to confirm what I was already beginning to understand. This was not part of his plan. This was not something he had accounted for. Any additional matters can be addressed through the proper channels, he said, attempting again to redirect, to contain, but the room was no longer his to manage. Not entirely, not anymore. Harold's gaze shifted again, this time more clearly, more intentionally, and every person who followed that line of sight found me, sitting at table 17, no longer hidden by distance or shadow, just visible, undeniably present. This matter involves Lila Bennett, he said, and hearing my name spoken in that tone, in that context, in front of all those people, felt different from every other time it had been said that night. Because this time it was not followed by a qualifier, not softened, not diminished, just stated, clear and complete. And I felt the room adjust around that fact, the attention settling, the narrative beginning to shift in ways no one could yet fully understand, including me. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty: whatever came next was not going to leave me where I had been sitting all night, because for the first time I was not being referenced as an afterthought. I was being called forward into something that had already been set in motion long before anyone else realized it had even begun. For a second no one moved, not even me, even though my name was still hanging in the air, clear and undeniable, like it belonged there in a way it never had before. And I could feel it, the shift, subtle but real, people turning just enough to see me fully now. Not as a background detail, not as someone sitting at the edge of the room, but as the person the moment had just been handed to, and it felt strange, not overwhelming, just unfamiliar. Like stepping into a space that had always existed but was never meant for you until now. My father followed their gaze, turning slowly, his eyes landing on me with a look I had never seen directed at me before. Not disappointment, not dismissal, something closer to uncertainty, and that alone told me everything I needed to know, because uncertainty was not something he allowed into his world unless he had no choice. Lila? He said, my name sounding different in his voice now, less certain, more careful, and I stood up, not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to meet the moment where it was, smoothing the front of my dress out of habit, my movement steady, controlled, because the last thing I was going to do was rush into something my grandmother had spent years preparing. I stepped away from the table, aware of every eye tracking me now, the distance between table 17 and the center of the room suddenly feeling shorter than it ever had. Each step measured, quiet but deliberate, and with every step, something inside me settled further into place. Not confidence exactly, something deeper than that, something grounded in the simple fact that I was not walking into something unknown. I was walking into something that had already been decided. I stopped a few feet from Harold, close enough to hear him without effort, close enough for everyone else to hear too, and for a brief second we just looked at each other, no words, just acknowledgement, the kind that does not need explanation. And then he nodded slightly, a small gesture but one that felt like permission or maybe confirmation. Miss Bennett, he said, his tone formal, precise. Your grandmother left specific instructions regarding the timing and conditions under which certain documents were to be presented. And I felt the room tighten around those words, because this was no longer vague, no longer implied, this was structured, intentional, designed. My father took a step forward, trying to reclaim some control. If this involves my daughter, I believe it would be more appropriate to handle this privately, he said, his voice firm again, but there was something underneath it now, something less stable. Harold did not look at him, not even for a second. The instructions were very clear, he replied. This is to be presented in the presence of witnesses, and I could almost hear my grandmother's voice layered beneath his, calm, certain, unmoved by objection. I glanced briefly at Audrey, her expression composed but no longer certain, her eyes searching my face as if trying to find something she had never needed to look for before. And then at my mother, who was watching me now without the practiced smile, without the distance, just watching, as if seeing me required more attention than she had ever given before. And I realized something in that moment that should have felt heavier than it did. They were all waiting for me, not to step back, not to stay quiet, but to respond, to participate, to exist fully in a moment that had been defined without me for so long. And I did not feel the need to hesitate, not anymore. Go ahead, I said, my voice steady, clear, carrying just enough to be heard without forcing it, and the simplicity of those two words seemed to shift the room again, because I was not asking for permission, I was not deferring, I was accepting, and Harold opened the leather folder, the motion slow, deliberate, revealing a set of documents that had clearly been prepared with intention, the paper crisp, the edges sharp, nothing about it rushed or uncertain, and as he lifted the top page, I felt it, that quiet certainty expanding into something undeniable, because whatever was written there, whatever had been arranged long before this night began, was about to be spoken out loud, in a room full of people who had spent years believing they already knew exactly who I was, and for the first time I was not wondering what they would think, I was wondering how they would react. When that belief no longer held, the sound of paper being lifted should not have felt significant, but in that room, in that moment, it was the loudest thing I had heard all night, sharper than applause, heavier than any word my father had spoken, and I watched as Harold Pierce adjusted the document in his hands, not rushing, not hesitating, just aligning it with the exact precision of someone who understood that what he was about to read did not need drama to carry weight. It already had it. "This is an addendum to the estate plan of Margaret Bennet," he began, his voice steady, measured, each word placed carefully so there was no confusion, no room for interpretation, and I felt the room tighten again, attention narrowing, people leaning just slightly closer without realizing it, because now there was structure, legal language, authority, the kind of thing that could not be dismissed as a misunderstanding or a mistake. My father opened his mouth as if to interrupt, then closed it, choosing instead to listen because even he understood that stopping this now would only make it worse. Harold continued, "This document was filed and sealed under instruction to be presented only under specific conditions." He paused briefly, not for effect, but because the words themselves required space. "Those conditions have now been met. And I saw it, the first real fracture in my father's control, not visible to everyone but clear to me, the slight tightening of his jaw, the shift in his stance, the realization that whatever this was, it had been planned beyond his reach. The beneficiary named in this addendum is Lila Bennet," Harold said, and hearing it stated so directly, so formally, without hesitation, without qualification, felt like something inside the room had been quietly turned on its axis. I did not move, did not react outwardly, but I could feel every eye on me now, not curious, not dismissive, but focused, because this was no longer about comparison, no longer about roles, this was about designation, about something being assigned, recognized, confirmed. My mother's hand slipped slightly from my father's arm, a small movement, but enough to signal that even she did not know what came next. Audrey stood completely still, her expression carefully held in place, but her eyes no longer steady, they moved just slightly between me and the document as if trying to understand how I had become part of something she had always assumed would belong to her. Harold turned the page, the soft sound cutting through the silence again. "In accordance with the terms outlined herein," he continued, "all assets specified within this addendum are to be transferred directly and exclusively to the named beneficiary." Another pause, this one longer, not because he needed it, but because the room did. "Effective immediately upon presentation." And there it was, the moment where everything that had been implied became real, not a possibility, not a discussion, but a decision already made, already finalized. I saw my father step forward again, unable to hold back now. "What assets?" he asked, his voice controlled but no longer smooth, the edge beneath it finally visible, and Harold did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached into the folder once more, retrieving a second document, heavier, thicker. And as he held it up, I recognized it before he said a word, not because I had seen it before, but because my grandmother had described it to me in a way that only made sense now. "A check," she had said once, her voice quiet but certain. "Not just money but proof." And as Harold turned the document toward the light, making the numbers visible even from a distance, I felt something shift completely, not just in the room, but in the story everyone had been telling about me. Because numbers like that did not just change circumstances, they changed perception, they forced people to reconsider what they thought they understood. And as the first few people near the front leaned in, their expressions shifting from curiosity to something closer to disbelief, I realized that the moment my grandmother had prepared for, the moment she had delayed, protected, and timed so precisely, had finally arrived, and nothing about it was uncertain anymore. No one said the number out loud at first, they did not need to, because the moment Harold angled the document just enough for the front row to see it, the reaction moved faster than words ever could, a subtle intake of breath here, a step closer there, eyes narrowing then widening, and then that unmistakable shift when disbelief turns into recognition, because numbers like that do not hide, they announce themselves without sound, and I saw it travel through the room like a Wave, quiet but unstoppable. My father's gaze locked onto the check, not blinking, not moving, as if staring at it long enough might change what it said. "This is not correct," he said finally, his voice lower now, tighter, not for the room but for control, for himself. There must be some kind of error. And it was the first time all night that he sounded like someone reacting instead of directing. Harold did not respond immediately. He simply turned the document slightly, enough for my father to see it clearly, fully, undeniably. "The amount is clearly stated," he said, calm, precise, leaving no space for reinterpretation, and I watched as my father's composure adjusted again, not collapsing, not breaking but recalibrating, because that was what he did. He adapted. He found a way to stand inside a situation even when it did not belong to him. "And you are saying this was authorized by my mother?" he asked, each word chosen carefully, like stepping across something unstable. "Yes," Harold replied just as carefully. "Authorized, documented, and executed according to her instructions." And I could feel the room leaning into that word, executed, because it carried finality, something that could not be undone by argument or influence. My mother spoke then, softly but enough to be heard. "Margaret would never have done this without discussing it with the family," she said, and there was something almost pleading beneath the sentence. Not for the room, but for reality to return to something she recognized. Harold's expression did not change. "She did discuss it," he said. "Just not in the way you expected." And I felt that land not as a blow but as a correction, quiet and absolute. Audrey took a small step forward then, her voice steady but no longer certain. "If there was an addendum, why was it not disclosed during the initial review?" she asked, and for the first time, she was not performing, she was trying to understand. Harold looked at her briefly, then back at the document. "Because the conditions for disclosure had not yet been met," he said, and I felt that sentence settle into place, completing something that had been building since the moment my grandmother first spoke to me about timing, about waiting, about letting things unfold exactly when they needed to. My father exhaled slowly, a controlled release, buying time, recalculating again. "And those conditions," he said, his eyes shifting to me now, not past me, not around me but directly at me, "involve Lila." And Harold nodded once. "They do." And that was it, the confirmation, simple, direct, unavoidable. I stood there, not saying anything, not needing to, because everything that mattered was already being said without me. And yet it was all about me, every glance, every pause, every recalculation in the room orbiting around something my grandmother had set in motion long before this night existed, and for the first time I understood the full weight of what she had done. She had not just given me something valuable, she had chosen the moment, the audience, the structure. She had built a situation where the truth could not be ignored, could not be dismissed, could not be reduced to opinion. And as I looked at the check now, fully visible, fully real, I did not feel overwhelmed by it. I felt anchored by it, because it was not just money, it was proof that everything they had assumed about me, everything they had repeated, reinforced and believed, had never actually defined what I was capable of holding. And as the room stood there, suspended between what it thought it knew and what it was now being forced to accept, I realized something that felt both simple and impossible at the same time. This was not the moment I became something different. This was the moment everyone else realized I already was. The silence did not break all at once. It fractured slowly, unevenly, like something that had been holding together under pressure finally giving way in small, controlled pieces. Whispers started first, low and uncertain, people leaning toward each other, repeating what they thought they had just seen, what they thought they had just heard. Because even in a room full of people used to large numbers and high stakes, this was different. This was not a deal, not a projection, not a possibility. This was final, documented, and assigned. And I could feel the shift in how they were looking at me now, no longer passing over me, no longer dismissing me as part of the background, but trying actively to place me into a new context they did not yet understand. My father remained still for a moment longer, then took a step closer to Harold, lowering his voice just enough to suggest control without actually achieving it. "We need to review this in detail," he said, and I recognized the move immediately, not denial, not rejection, but delay, an attempt to pull the situation out of the public space where it had power and into a private one where he could reshape it, reinterpret it, possibly even contain it. But Harold did not shift, did not follow, did not concede. "The document has already been filed and executed," he replied. "There is nothing to review that will change the outcome." And that was the moment the option of control disappeared completely, not gradually, not negotiably, just gone. My mother stepped forward then, closer than she had been all night, her attention no longer divided, no longer filtered through Audrey, but fixed directly on me. "Lila," she said, my name softer now, unfamiliar in that tone. Did you know about this? And for a second I considered the question. Not because I needed time to answer, but because I understood what she was really asking. She was not asking about information, she was asking about alignment, about whether I had stepped outside the role they had defined for me without their permission. I met her gaze steady, calm. I knew my grandmother had plans, I said, my voice even measured, but I did not know the details, which was true but not complete, because what I had known was not specifics, it was intent, it was timing, it was trust. Audrey finally spoke again, her voice controlled but carrying a sharp edge now. This does not make sense, she said, not to Harold, not even to my father, but to the situation itself. Grandma would not have bypassed the structure we already established. And there it was again, structure, the word that had defined everything in our family, the system that placed her at the center and me at the edge, and for the first time, I could see her trying to reconcile a reality that did not fit inside it. Harold turned one final page in the folder, slower this time, more deliberate, as if he understood that what came next was not just information but explanation. There is an attached letter, he said, written and signed by Margaret Bennett, to be read in conjunction with this addendum, and I felt something inside me shift. Again, not uncertainty, not anticipation, something closer to recognition, because this was the part my grandmother had hinted at without ever fully revealing, the part that was not just about assets but about reasoning, about why. And as Harold began to unfold the letter, the room settled once more, quieter than before, more focused, because now they were not just reacting, they were waiting to understand, and I realized that whatever my grandmother had written, whatever she had decided to say in her own words, was about to do something no amount of money could do on its own. It was going to redefine the story, not just for them, but for me, and for the first time in my life, I was not bracing for what people would say about me. I was ready to hear what someone who had truly seen me had already written down long before anyone else thought to look. Harold unfolded the letter slowly, carefully, as if even the paper itself carried weight. And when he looked up, it was not at my father, not at Audrey, but directly at me again, a quiet acknowledgement before he began. To my family. He read, his voice steady, but something in it softened just slightly, as if he understood these were not just legal words. If you are hearing this, then I am no longer there to explain it myself, which means I must trust that what I have written will be enough. And I felt it immediately, the difference between this and everything else that had been said tonight. This was not performance, not positioning, not control, this was intention, clear and unfiltered. For many years I have observed how each of you moves through the world, how you speak, how you decide, how you measure value. He continued, and I could feel the room lean in again, not out of curiosity this time, but something closer to discomfort, because this was no longer about money, this was about judgment. Thomas. He read, and my father's name in my grandmother's words landed differently than it ever had in conversation. You have built a system that rewards confidence, speed, and presentation, and there is value in that, but you have also mistaken those traits for understanding. My father did not move, but I saw the tension settle into his shoulders, the kind he could not smooth over with posture or tone. Audrey, Harold continued, and my sister's name followed with the same clarity. You have learned to excel within that system, and you have done so well, but you have also been protected by it, and protection is not the same as strength. Audrey's expression held, but something in her eyes shifted, just slightly, like a question she had never needed to ask before was now unavoidable. And then Harold paused, just long enough for the room to feel the absence of sound. Before the next name, Lila, he said, and hearing my name in my grandmother's voice, even through someone else, felt like stepping into something that had always been waiting for me. You were never the one they understood, he read. And because of that, you were never shaped by their expectations. And I felt something tighten in my chest, not pain, not exactly, something deeper, something that had been there for years without a name. You do not rush to speak. You do not need to be seen to observe, and you do not confuse attention with value. He continued, each sentence settling into the room with more weight than the last. You see patterns where others see noise, connections where others see fragments, and because of that, you understand things they do not even realize they are missing. And I could feel it now, not just the shift in the room but the shift inside myself, because this was not new information. Not entirely, but it was the first time it had been said out loud. In a way that could not be dismissed, could not be reduced to something smaller. The assets I have assigned to you are not a reward, Harold read, his voice steady again. They are a responsibility, because I believe you are the only one who will not be blinded by what they represent. And that was it, the part that changed everything, because this was no longer about fairness, no longer about who deserved what, it was about trust. About judgment, about a decision made by someone who had seen all of us clearly and chosen differently than anyone expected. Harold lowered the letter slightly, not finished, but enough to let the words settle, and the room did not move, did not speak, did not react in the ways it usually did, because there was no easy response to something like that, no polite applause, no immediate recovery, just silence, and in that silence I realized something that felt both quiet and absolute. This was not the moment I was being given something. This was the moment everything that had been said about me, every label, every assumption, every quiet dismissal, was being replaced by something far more difficult to ignore, because it had been written down, signed, and delivered in front of everyone who had once believed. Otherwise no one moved even after Harold lowered the letter completely, not because they did not know what to do, but because there was nothing left to do that would restore what had just been undone, the structure my father had built, the certainty Audrey had lived inside, the quiet role I had been assigned. All of it still existed in memory, but it no longer held authority in that room, not after something so precise, so deliberate had replaced it. I looked at my father first because for as long as I could remember, his reaction had defined how every situation unfolded, but this time he was not leading anything, he was standing still, eyes fixed somewhere between the document and me, as if trying to reconcile two versions of reality that refused to align. And for the first time he did not speak immediately, he did not correct, did not redirect, did not reshape the moment into something he could control. He simply stood there. And that silence said more than anything he had ever said out loud. My mother's expression had softened into something I had never seen before either. Not quite regret, not quite understanding, something in between, like she was looking at me and realizing there had always been something there she chose not to see. Audrey did not look at anyone, not even me, her gaze lowered just slightly, her posture still perfect, but no longer anchored in certainty, and I realized then that this was not just my moment, it was theirs too, the moment they were being forced to confront the difference between what they had believed and what had always been true. Harold closed the folder with the same calm precision he had opened it, the sound final, conclusive. The transfer will be completed immediately, he said, not loudly, not dramatically, just as a statement of fact, and then he turned to me, extending the document, not ceremoniously, not performatively, just directly, as if this had always been the simplest part of the process. I reached out and took it, my hand steady, not because I was unaffected, but because I understood that this moment was not about reacting, it was about accepting something that had already been decided long before I walked into this room. The paper felt solid in my hand, real, undeniable, and for a brief second I thought about everything that had led here, the years of being overlooked, the quiet observations, the conversations with my grandmother that had never quite made sense until now, and how none of it had been random, none of it had been wasted. It had all been part of something she had seen clearly even when no one else did. I looked up again, meeting my father's eyes, and for the first time there was no expectation there, no assumption, no label waiting to be reinforced, just uncertainty. And something else beneath it. Something closer to recognition, not of what I had become, but of what I had always been. And I realized that I did not need to say anything to change that. The moment had already done it for me. The room began to shift slowly, people stepping back into movement, voices returning in low, measured tones, but nothing about it felt the same because now every conversation carried a different awareness, a recalibration of everything they thought they understood. And as I stood there, no longer at the edge, no longer outside the frame, I felt something settle into place, not triumph, not revenge, something quieter, something more complete, because this was never about proving them wrong, it was about no longer needing their version of me to define anything at all. And as I glanced down once more at the document in my hands, then back up at the room that had finally been forced to see me differently, I understood what my grandmother had meant all along, not just about timing, not just about patience, but about truth, because truth does not argue, it does not chase, it simply waits until it can no longer be ignored. And then it arrives exactly when it is meant to.